daily jobs, coffee, and an awfully big adventure. A System Apocalypse short story. Written by Tao Wong. Narrated by Daniela Acitelli. Wendy rolled out of bed with a groan, glancing balefully at the flashing notification window that told her she was supposed to be asleep. Lack of sleep, exhaustion, low stamina. The bars all ran through the window before she dismissed it with a flick of her hand. As she put her feet on the ground, she ran her hand through her ratty brown hair, catching on knots as she did so. She tugged on her nightdress, pulling it down across her chubby, nicely padded body while she shuffled to the bathroom. Why couldn't they fix my hair and my insomnia? They got the wrinkles and the eyes. Wendy whined once more, her thick Devonshire accent coming through. In answer, a small glowing bat flew down, flashing through a variety of colors and angular shapes. Wendy smiled, somehow understanding the spirit's words. No, I don't want to find out about the system. I studied enough about that quest, Wendy muttered. I've got better things to do, like coffee. The last word was uttered with a fierce exertion of will as she made it a command. Another flash of light, this time brilliant green, lit up the small, cluttered bedroom. Clothing, scavenged from multiple houses, worn and tossed aside, lay scattered throughout the room. Multiple smaller oblong boxes were attached to the ceiling and walls, reinforcing the apartment and her safe room. She still didn't have enough money to make the room a safe zone, so she made do. Luckily, her friends were very good at helping her make do. The little flashing blonde pixie dressed in green that appeared would be a trademark infringement, if it mattered these days. It buzzed for a second, then flew out the door to the kitchen, where it started the process of brewing Wendy her mid-morning java. Meanwhile, Wendy started casting, using her skill to pull her friends from the nether. Let's see. Boom and zoom, you've got the room. Curly, breakfast. None of that fancy stuff. I want bacon, eggs, and mushrooms. A good English breakfast. She ignored the grumpy buzzing as the summoned fairies got to work. Nibs, outfit for the day. It'll be a busy day. Muttering commands, more and more summons appeared. When she was done, Wendy was down to less than a quarter of her mana, but her friends were all buzzing around, cleaning and sorting her bedroom. By the time she was done with her shower, they had set right the apartment, making it sparkling fresh and leaving her coffee and breakfast for her. Grinning wide, Wendy bobbed her head in thanks to her friends before she dismissed them once more. Better to do it now, before they disappeared of their own volition. After all, she regained a little bit of her mana this way. Breakfast. Then I'll deal with these emails. I wish there was a fairy for that. Musing about how she could create an email fairy, Wendy dug into her meal. Outside, in the crisp, refreshing morning air of Devonshire, Wendy drew a deep breath. Already she'd summoned a host of her friends before sending them out to scout for monsters. The guards had it mostly in hand, really, but it never hurt to be cautious. Even the ones that wandered in past the old Roman walls that ringed the inner city of Exeter were swiftly taken care of. But she hadn't survived the first 9 months of the apocalypse by being careless. In fact, Wendy wasn't exactly sure how she'd survived at all. Oh, she could relate everything she'd gone through, every second of it, just like any of the other survivors. But why her? Compared to the rest of humanity, perhaps it was her naturally high luck stat? Perhaps it was her ability to use her friends in different ways. It didn't really matter, because much as she wished it was different, it wasn't. They had managed to fight off enough of the monsters, patched together enough of civilization to reclaim Exeter. Not without suffering quite a few losses, especially among the elderly that made up the majority of the citizens. But there'd been a surprising number of old soldiers who'd taken to the system and come out swinging. Shaking her head, Wendy continued her walk, eyeing the white-painted houses, the shops that made up the new Exeter. Gone were the old, single or double-story scattering of neighborhood commercial districts. Instead, some gleamed with metal-reinforced doors, reclaimed by the occasional adventurous entrepreneur. Others were left broken, windows shattered, doors cracked, waiting for their new owners. Wendy hoped there would be more reclaimed soon. It'd make the neighborhood safer, but the center of Exeter was where the rebuilding was concentrated. She was considered weird for staying on the outskirts, away from the others. But she liked her apartment, and she had plans for the complex when she'd earned enough credits. Marveling at the robust growth of the trees, running her fingers along crisp bark, Wendy continued her saunter as the sun rose. 9 months on, the morning sun was getting late in its autumn ascent. Soon enough, winter would be here in full force. She hoped she'd have enough credits by then, because if not, she'd have to move into town. She didn't fancy sleeping in the cold, not at all. Finally reaching the church grounds, Wendy looked up at the soaring Exeter Cathedral. The religious building sparkled, the worn statues of saints in the front, built in the old Baroque style that had now been upgraded by the system. Now they looked just as new, and if you watched really closely, you'd notice how all the saints with their swords and the gargoyles at the top slowly shifted. It really did bring a new meaning to the words, "God is watching over you." Pushing past the large wooden entrance doors, Wendy stepped into the cathedral. She paused for a second, crossing herself in respect before she entered further. The pews within were gone, the seating replaced by cots for those artisans and adventurers who couldn't afford a better place to stay. Nuns moved around quietly, watching over the thrashing bodies, laying soothing hands on a few that needed it, radiating auras of peace and serenity. The big wooden and silver organ stood grandiosely in the back, out of place but beautiful still. Once a week, the bishop continued to hold services and the organ would play. It brought comfort, a sense of stability to the parishioners. "Still can't sleep?" The words jolted Wendy back into her body. She turned to regard the speaker, dressed in military fatigues, bright red hair in curls, and a futuristic mace resting on his knees. Carl smiled back. "No, you'd think they'd mind," she said. She knew he fancied her, but she just didn't have time. Even if the desire was there, Carl was a fetching bloke, especially since he upgraded his strength and started wearing those sleeveless vests. "Nah, just keep your lads quiet." "Always." Smirking, Wendy moved away from the entrance, putting her back to the column like Carl before she began her summons. "First twin, second twin, dirty betting, tubs, nibs, scraps, boom and zoom, the organ, quietly." Wendy started summoning. Tiny little fairies appeared as their names were called, bobbing quickly before rushing to do their jobs. Unlike in her room, they all acknowledged her unspoken desire and kept their lights dimmed as they got to work. In a few minutes, her mana was depleted, and Wendy turned to Carl. "So, how's the hoarding going?" "It's not hoarding. I tell you, toilet paper is gold. Soon enough, they'll all be coming to me," Carl said, crossing his arms. "I got it all. 2-ply, 3-ply. The shop might get you some, but not in good quality, not at a good price. Somehow, they still haven't gotten it right yet, not without teleporting it from somewhere else on Earth." Wendy just smiled, shaking her head. For all the 4 months she'd known Carl, he'd had a scheme, a way of making it big. They all failed, of course, but since his schemes never hurt anyone, she and the father never made a fuss. Having Carl around kept them all safer, too, as one of the few combat classers who would stay to guard the cathedral. "Less people here today," she said, eyeing the beds. "Less need. They opened up another apartment block." She frowned, hating the sound of that. If she didn't get a move on, her own plans were going to get scuppered. Maybe... Biting her lip, Wendy accessed the settlement's quest board. That was a relatively new addition that allowed anyone, anywhere in the settlement, to access it without being at a settlement stone. It made finding jobs a lot easier. Unfortunately, it also meant that there was a lot more competition these days. Good thing she was very good at what she did. An hour later, the cathedral was clean and shiny. Everything from the windows to the insides of the organ were buffed and cleaned. Waste food, torn bandages, even holes in clothing had been patched up. The moment she completed her daily task, System acknowledged her quest completion and deposited the funds from the cathedral's account into hers. Bobbing, thanks to Carl, Wendy hurried off, already having taken on another 2 assignments. There were another half dozen that she could do on the board. If she managed to get all of them, maybe she would finally have enough to buy her own place. Problem was, she was limited to only 2 additional quests beyond her usual standing orders, so she had to hurry if she wanted to get them all. The first quest was a tanning job. No one wanted to do that. Not even the tanners, really, though, obviously, their skills made it easier for them. But there were only 3 system tanners in the entire city, and all but one of them had leveled up such that they no longer did the low-level monsters' jobs. That left a gap in the market, one that Wendy and her summons were more than happy to fill. As she hurried along, Wendy checked her skill once more, eyeing her experience bar at the same time. Elemental Summons, Level 4. Summon an elemental to act as your familiar. Summoned elementals will follow all orders for the duration of their summons. Effect: summon 1 lesser elemental. Mana cost: 60 per summon. Duration: 11.2 minutes. Summoner's Horde, Level 3. Quantity over quality is this summoner's motto. Rather than a single, powerful summon, this summoner has split her strength of the summons into multiple, smaller creatures. Mana regeneration is reduced by 15 permanently. Effect: summoner may split each summon instance into 3, equal or lesser summons. Strength of individual summons is decreased by 6 times. Wendy sighed. She was so close to another level and a new class skill. If she increased her elemental summons ability, she increased the strength and size of her summons. Right now she was forced to make fewer summons just because they weren't strong enough to do anything by themselves if she split them further. On the other hand, being able to split her horde allowed her to tackle more jobs with a wider variety. Some jobs just needed a lot of hands. Of course, completing these quests gave her only a modicum of experience. As much as she had cursed her class, which she did regularly, what she had was a combat class. She gained experience by killing monsters. Or at least, she should have. It was the perfect method, if you ignored the screaming pain, blood, and terror that fighting entailed. Wendy bit her lip again and did the math as she started summoning her friends the moment she arrived at the former shopping mall, now turned tanning center. While she thought and ordered her sprites around, she did the math. Her leveling had slowed down to a crawl ever since she breached her last level. Maybe if she just ran 1 kill and retrieve quest, get some food for the settlement. That was always in demand. Those mutated and vicious timber wolves that had appeared, they gave a lot of experience. "What do you think, lads?" Wendy called out to her sprites, who bobbed and weaved as they scrubbed down hides, removing fur, fat, then tissue. As they dumped cleaned furs in the urine baths and then worked them out, to treat the hides, they'd had to go old school when they realized that normal chemicals just didn't work. Not against monster hides, but processing via system methods, using system-processed urine, that still worked. Well, at least it wasn't brains. Well? Silence greeted Wendy's words. As much as she enjoyed her work, she sometimes wished that she had some company. Her lads were just not very talkative. 2 hours later, she hurried out of the tanning center, making a face as she noticed that some of the other early risers had already started snatching up quests. Wendy's next job was an easy one, a simple house-cleaning job for an adventurer party, and then, afterwards, she was off to the automotive center. Out of the way, but she was often the only person on duty. With her team, she could buff and fix the vehicle bodies faster than anyone else. She hurried, only pausing long enough to send one of her fairies to pick up a second breakfast. A second fairy accompanied it to pick up a cup of coffee. Summoning and controlling her babies was hard work, and coffee was a necessity. Midday found her seated outside the cathedral greens, enjoying the weather. You couldn't even notice where the ghouls had risen up anymore. They cleaned out all the old bodies after the last time. A good thing, too. No one wanted that particularly horrid reminder. "Company?" Carl called out to Wendy as he plopped down beside her. "I think you've just invited yourself," she said. He flashed her a wide grin, but also offered her a curry as a peace offering. "Which shop?" "Kummar's, off Musgrave," Carl replied. "Is it meat?" "Didn't ask." When she narrowed her eyes, Carl started pulling back the plastic container. "It's fine. I'll eat it." "Give it here, you plunker," Wendy snapped at him, snatching the container back. She made her fork appear in her hands from her inventory and dove in. After the first few mouthfuls, she let out an appreciative grunt. "So, what do you think?" she asked when she finished her meal. "The meat?" Carl said. When she nodded, he rubbed at his chin. "Dear, I think." "Me too." Wendy fell silent, thinking of the wolves. "Penny for your thoughts," Carl prodded. Literally, his fork digging into her knee. Wendy yelped, slapped at his hands, and then turned to look around carefully. It wasn't as though she was worried about someone overhearing what she had to say. She wasn't doing anything illegal, but occasionally scanning the green, taking in the few trees, other empty buildings around, the lounging artisans who were taking a break from their own grind. All of it had become routine. "Just thinking about the wolves." Wendy missed the flash of concern in Carl's eyes when she mentioned the monsters. She was too busy tracing on the ground with the end of her fork. "I just need a couple thousand more experience. A good hunt and the quest completion, and I'll get my level. Then I'll have enough money, or I will soon enough." Carl frowned. "You know it's not safe to go alone right now." She shrugged. "They all have teams now, even my old group, and no one wants a scaredy-cat elemental summoner." "You're not." Wendy's frown made him stop. "So, you intend to go alone?" "Probably, after my next job," she said. She glanced at the time and then stood up, brushing her hands down and making the plastic container disappear into her storage. "Which I'm late for, if I don't leave now." Without waiting for him to reply, she hurried off, leaving the man to finish his own food alone. Hunting was strange. Other people had visions of tramping through woods, crossing rivers, and pushing through thick fog banks. But the reality was, for most of the adventurers, hunting happened in the suburbs, in the abandoned residential buildings and neighborhoods that ringed the city proper. Ever since humanity had lost 90% of its population, they had shrunk back into the heart of their cities. Mother Nature and the system had taken over with a vengeance everywhere else. Wendy spied a building, or what used to be a building, ahead of her with trepidation. It looked like it had collapsed upon itself, the vines that had grown around the building pulling the walls down, sending the roof crashing down, and then the vines had grown over the roof remnants, burying the materials beneath it. Of course, normal vegetation wasn't that much of a concern, except these vines had also just eaten one of her summons, snatched it right out of the air. Wendy bit her lip, debating between summoning something larger and potentially destroying the monster vine or leaving it alone. The experience might be good, but she'd not heard of this monster. And monsters, new monsters, always had nasty surprises in store. Maybe the grasping vines were just the start of it. Maybe it had something else, like poisonous spores that it kept in secret. After a moment more deliberation, Wendy shook her head and hurried away. As much as she wanted the experience, her goal were the 𝗕𝗲𝗃𝗁𝗃, and one of her babies had found tracks. She hurried down the broken paved streets, moving in the center of the road, so that she could have more time to react if something rose from the buildings. Wendy kept her senses peeled for her babies. She kind of wished she'd splurged on a map skill, but it just hadn't seemed important at the time. She could feel all her babies, sense what they sensed, see what they saw if she concentrated. It was as good as a map skill. Sort of. Not really. But she told herself that, at least for this expedition. She continued to hurry along, then frowned at a little gray blip, a sense of wrongness that Nibs sent to her. Nibs was at her back, guarding her from potential backstabs, and thus far, that gray blip kept on following her. She couldn't tell what it was, not at all. It could be a monster, a scavenger, one of the untransformed wild dogs or cats, or another human hoping to scavenge from her kills. No way to know. So, for now, she'd ignore it, and keep one of her children watching. A quarter of an hour hike later, Wendy was crouched next to her sprite, staring down at a family-sized piece of poo. She wrinkled her nose, smelling the fragrant deposit, watching as the flies landed and rummaged around their treasure. To what would have shocked her prim and proper mother's dismay, over the past 9 months, Wendy had gained a little tracking knowledge. In particular, she could tell from the consistency and hardness of the poo that it had been a recent deposit, not dry enough or hard enough in the autumn chill to be more than a few hours old. No, this was deposited within the last half hour. That meant the pack was around here. All she had to do was find them. Boom, zoom. Wendy chanted the names, summoning her friends to her. Just as she was about to give orders, she felt the shiver of disquiet from one of her children. She tilted her head to the side and froze. A quick switch of viewpoint, and then again and again. Sweat began pouring down her back. She was surrounded, the wolves somehow having crept past the initial line of her children. They'd turn her from predator to prey, surrounding her. There were 4 of them, and they were a lot smarter than she had thought. "Defense," Wendy whispered her command, putting the 2 muscular sprites on guard duty. Next, mental summons brought half her sprites zooming back from their scouting positions. She left the ones who had view of the timber wolves where they were, adjusted the positioning of a few more. All she could do now was summon another 2 to her, and she should be out of mana. A slight twitch of her hands as the wolves crept closer brought a beam pistol into her hand. It wasn't perfect, but at least she still had her shield bracelet. As one of the timber wolves slunk out from the shadows from directly behind her, she whispered the command to her babies. "Stun and run!" Toodles swooped down, spiraling directly into the timber wolf's back. The shoulder check by a 4-inch sprite filled with glitter sent the wolf sprawling as it got ready to jump. Wendy ignored that byplay and the other strafing runs by her sprites as she opened fire on the first wolf to show its face to her. The laser beam clipped the monster as it jumped aside, leaving a burning trail across its reinforced metallic fur. The wolf was half again the size of an unmutated creature, yet it still carried the same litheness, the same agility of movement, and, just as worryingly, its level was way too high. Timber wolf, level 16. HP, 218 of 274. No time to waste. Wendy ran, firing her pistol when she had a clear line of sight. The beam pistol only had just over 20 shots, though, so she had to be careful. Reloading was likely going to be a problem. She cursed, wondering why she thought she could do this. She groaned, even as she dashed down the suburban street, row houses on both sides, dark and many of them trashed. She briefly considered ducking into one of the houses, using it as shelter, but you never knew what were in the houses. She could just as easily stumble onto something even worse than the timber wolves. Instead, she ran. If she could injure them, maybe even kill them, maybe they'd break away. And so, while she snapped off her shots and blocked snarling lunges with the shield bracer on her left arm, she tried to focus her returned children's attention on a singular monster. In truth, without her children buzzing in, slamming into the wolves, setting their fur on fire, she would have been caught already. Careful attacks were thrown off, nips at her heels blinded by showers of sparkles, and, occasionally, one of her children would be snapped out of the air. It hurt, in a way, to see her children die. It was different than being dismissed. She hated seeing them disappear, banished back home. It was what made being a summoner horrible, because even though she knew they were just balls of energy, mana given form, she still cared about them. It was why she'd named them. She ran, stamina dropping with each footstep. Of course she'd increased her constitution. No one who survived the apocalypse kept it at the base level. But she was a mage. She dumped most of her points into intelligence and willpower. And, she had to admit, maybe a point or two into charisma. Vanity was probably going to get her killed today. An unseen crack on the ground caught her foot. She stumbled, falling to the ground. Her gun jarred out of her hand and skipped ahead of her. The wordless cry of one of her children made her spin around, hunkering beneath the shield bracer as the wolf landed on top of her. Drool fell from its mouth, splattering her through the shield. She twisted and turned, attempting to throw the monster off. She was going to die. But Wendy refused to do so without a fight. She pushed back, tense muscles straining against the monster, trying to draw a breath to call upon her last summons. Then the monster was off, rolling across the ground. Surprised, she took the hand that reached down, pulling her to her feet. Without speaking, she also took the pistol that was shoved into her hand. Only then did Wendy stare at her rescuer, surprised to see Carl with his sparkling, flame-ridden mace beside her. "What?" "Later," Carl said. "I took one out, and the one that was on you looks pretty bad, but we're not done yet." Wendy nodded, taking quick stock of her resources. Pistol? Check. Shield bracer? Almost out of charge. Babies? 3 left. Mana? Enough for one more major summon. "Buy me time. I'm going to summon Pan," Wendy said. Carl shot her a look, but grunted in agreement anyway, as if there were any choice, for she had already begun muttering under her breath. As the first of the wolves threw itself at them, he stepped out to meet it in battle, his mace swinging. "All children, except one, grow up. From the second star on the right, come, your Wendy calls." She couldn't help but blush. It wasn't the kind of thing you wanted to say out loud. Fanciful dreams from the past were how she made the sprites, how she made everything work. But she needed them, just like she needed them when she was a kid, when the branches scratched at her windows late at night, when a parent screamed, fighting over the telly's channels, or the lack of tea. Carl came crashing back to the ground, arms pinned by a pair of wolves. The injured timber wolf had evaded Zoom and was charging her, ready to finish the job. Too late, for Pan was here. He wasn't even that big, just over 8 feet tall, but he glowed. He glowed with the flames of youth and passion, and when he struck, he sent the monster tumbling away with just a single blow. After that, the rest of the fight was magical. Cleanup sucked. Cleanup always sucked. Even with all her helpers out, Wendy couldn't help but grumble. Dragging the bodies back, after skinning, gutting, and looting them, took forever, especially when she kept half of her people watching for more trouble. Then, of course, it was up to her to hand in the skins, clean them, sell them, and complete her quests. The worst part of it all was because Carl had helped, she didn't even get the full quest rewards. Left her just shy of her experience needs. Nor did she have enough money after replacing her broken beam pistol to buy the apartment complex. "Did you make it?" Carl asked, leaning over her shoulder. Of course, he couldn't read her notification window, but it was still annoying. "No," Wendy said with a sigh. "Not enough. I'm so close." "Well," Carl paused, rubbing his nose. "I'm sorry." "It's fine. Tomorrow. I'll get it tomorrow," Wendy said, if something else didn't crop up. But, she knew, something else probably would. It's why she was so tired. Something always came up for the last 4 months. Then, remembering, she turned to Carl. "What were you doing there?" She put her hands on her hips, glaring at the man. The pale redhead flushed, shifting from foot to foot. "Well, I thought that, you see, He drew a deep breath and spoke in a rush. "I was following you." "I thought so." Carl flushed further and started edging away. She grabbed him by the arm, pulled him around so that he faced her, then she smiled. "Thank you. If you hadn't, well..." There was no need to explain. They had both seen enough loss. "You're welcome. So..." Carl looked up in the sky, noting the fading sunlight. "I guess I'll see you tomorrow." She paused, then offered him a smile. And for the first time, she offered, "Maybe we could do dinner instead. Tonight?" Carl paused, startled, before he offered her a big smile in return. It was a start, a change in their routine. He stepped forward, offering her his arm, which, after she had one of her children clean, she took. He led her off the cathedral green, towards High Street, and dinner. After a few steps, he looked over at Wendy and spoke. "You know, if you're looking for a good way to make some money, I've got this new idea." The end. This has been Daily Jobs, Coffee, and an Awfully Big Adventure, a System Apocalypse short story, written by 𝗕𝗏, narrated by 𝗕𝗏𝗃𝗃. Copyright 2020 by 𝗕𝗏. Production copyright 2020 by 𝗕𝗏.